Now we're moving past the section on sensing and responding to the environment into how do we get the energy for all that physiologizing that we're going to do, into energy processing and the systems that support that endeavor. How do we obtain the energy that we need to do all the things that we need to do? So let's put a little background to this. First off, from an energetic perspective, life has a lower entropy, or more order, than non-living things. This is a good thing. You have more usable energy in you than the clothes that you're wearing or the ground beneath your feet or things like that. Life gets this low energy by increasing the entropy of other materials or energy in its environment. Therefore, living things need to find a supply of low entropy energy for which the entropy can be increased to keep their entropy low. Now, animals and plants find this source of low entropy energy in two different ways. Animals use their living or use other living organisms to get it. Therefore, this makes them heterotrophs. Whereby plants, however, generally obtain their low entropy energy from non-living sources, sunlight, making them an autotroph. Now, let's talk about the major processes that we will talk about in this unit. And the first of these is metabolism. Now, technically, metabolism is the sum of all reactions that an organism uses, or all of them in that organism. Oftentimes, however, metabolism is used to more narrowly refer to processes associated with energy processing. So, for instance, obtaining energy, or eating, as we often call it, converting energetic molecules to ATP, which would be, in this case, digestion, and then after that, oxidative phosphorylation, and then storing that energy for later use and remobilizing that energy when you need it. In most animals, these processes will need the help of glucose and oxygen to operate. And we'll come back a little bit more to that about that in just a few minutes. And next in this unit, we're going to be talking about the circulatory system. It is this system that is primarily responsible for transporting that glucose and oxygen that's needed by metabolism to the cells that need it. The circulatory system will also handle the transporting metabolic wastes and byproducts away from cells after that builds up during the process of metabolism. And finally, we're going to talk about respiration. Now, here I'm not meaning cellular respiration, which we often use to refer to oxidative phosphorylation. What I mean here is organisms exchanging gases with their environment. Most animals need to capture oxygen to fuel their metabolism and release carbon dioxide that is produced as a byproduct of metabolism. Okay, now, let's begin the journey through these topics by talking about metabolism. Again, metabolism technically means the sum of all chemical reactions taking place in an organism. And these reactions can generally be put into two groups. First off is anabolism, which is the subset of metabolism that constructs molecules from smaller units. So this means synthesis reactions, which generally require some sort of energy input. In a more macro scale, this means things like growth and repair of tissues and nutrient storage and things like that. Now, in contrast to metabolism, or on the opposite side, there is catabolism, which is when we have molecules that are broken down into smaller units. And so this includes degradation reactions, which will often release energy during that process. And again, to think about this at the macro scale, this is going to include processes such as digestion and oxidative phosphorylation. Now let's just pause a minute there and talk a bit about oxidative phosphorylation, which is really, really important to this section on metabolism. Oxidative phosphorylation is a process that captures the energy from these low entropy molecules at the center of metabolism. Now, the processes that are central to oxidative phosphorylation are glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. However, there are some other processes that are important here, like fat breakdown during lipolysis and beta oxidation, and then we also have protein breakdown. And these will be supplying energy as well and feeding into Krebs cycle and onto electron transport chain. But the very core of this energy capture is these three processes. Now, these processes require oxygen and glucose to operate. Now, in this class, I'm not going to cover how these processes work in detail. If you're rusty on oxidative phosphorylation, I'd suggest you go back to your cell biology notes and brush up a bit. In this class, we're going to take a little bit more global perspective on how these processes fit together into the larger picture of how an animal goes about obtaining and using energy. Now, during these processes, animals are going to obey the laws of thermodynamics. Now, this might be pretty obvious, but this is going to provide us with a framework to understand how these processes must be regulated. Particularly important is the first law of thermodynamics, which states essentially that, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. This is energy conservation. Next, also, we have the second law of thermodynamics, which is also really important. And this states that all reactions are going to proceed in a way that's going to increase the entropy of the universe. Okay, so there, let's just pause for a moment or two and take a second to look and talk about a couple energy units that are going to be useful and used before we proceed here. First off is a calorie, which is an imperial unit, or essentially an Old English unit. And a calorie is the energy required to raise 1 gram of water from 14.5 C to 15.5 C, or really 1 degree Celsius. You've probably heard of calories before, particularly in reference to food. Nutritional calories, or calories with a capital C, are actually kilocalories, or 1,000 calories. This is what you're going to find when you look on the nutritional facts of some sort of food item. And this, therefore, would be the energy required to raise a liter of water from 14.5 C to 15.5 C. The metric equivalent of a calorie is a joule. A joule is equal to about 1/4 of 1 calorie, or another way of putting it is about 4.18 joules is equal to 1 calorie. And oftentimes when we're talking about things, we're going to be talking about kilojoules. Okay, so enough of that aside on units. Let's go back to the regulation of energy in and out of these animals. And one useful way to be doing that is energy budgeting. Now that we have all that out of the way and we've talked about thermodynamic principles that animals must obey, and let's put that into a framework for talking about how energy processing occurs in an organism, and that is an energy budget. On its face, an energy budget is a simple concept. The energy obtained by an organism will be equal to the energy used by an organism. This is just the conservation of energy realized. Now, in practice, this gets a little bit more complicated, so let's break down each side of this equation a little bit more. Let's start with the left side, the energy inputs. First off, essentially all animals are heterotrophic. They obtain their energy from other living organisms. The food that they consume is predominantly composed of 3 classes of energetic molecules that can be used. Carbohydrates are sugars, and these are going to contain about 17.1 kilojoules of energy per gram. That's going to vary a little bit depending on the particular kind of carbohydrate. And then we have protein, which also contains very similar amounts of energy, about 17.9 kilojoules of energy per gram. And then we have fats, which are much more energetic than the previous two, and these are going to contain somewhere in the neighborhood of 38.9 kilojoules per gram. Quite a bit. Not all of the food that is eaten makes it out of the animal's digestive tract, or what we call absorbed. This portion of the eaten food will be excreted as feces, as the first major loss that we have of energy after the time that the food is consumed. Now let's take a look at the other side of this equation, the energy outputs. And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. The inputs are easy, Animals eat things. Pretty straightforward. However, animals will use the energy consumed in a lot of different ways. However, despite all of this diversity of energetic uses, the ultimate fate of essentially all the energy absorbed by the digestive tract is to become heat. This begins in oxidative phosphorylation, where about half of all of the energy consumed in the material consumed is lost as heat. Further down the line, during ATP hydrolysis, again we lose about 50% of the remaining energy as heat. This means only about a quarter of the original energy absorbed is left to do useful work. It's even a lower percentage if you consider how much energy was in the food before absorption and count the energy that we lost as feces. Also, ATP hydrolysis at times can be even less efficient than this, such as in skeletal muscle where it loses about 75% of its energy as heat rather than just the 50%. Finally, even the energy that results in useful work will become heat as it contributes to like friction and motion and things like that as it's actually performing useful work. Okay, besides heat, where does this energy go? First up is basal metabolic rate. This is essentially all the energy-consuming metabolic processes that occur at rest, or when there's no other major energy demands on an organism. So as things are just sitting there doing nothing, how much energy is being consumed by that organism? That is our basal metabolic rate. Above that, we have the energy that will be consumed during activity, when things are moving around. For example, this would include the energy that is consumed by skeletal muscle as it operates during locomotion, or something like that. Next up, we have this thing known as specific dynamic action, or the SDA, which can also sometimes be called diet-induced thermogenesis. This is the extra energy consumed above and beyond the basal metabolic rate after eating. This comes in two flavors. The obligatory SDA is the energy that has to be used after eating. This is the energy that is used to process the material that was just consumed, to move it through the gut to break it down, to move food through your stomach, through your intestines, and to break all that down. That's going to take some energy. That is the obligatory SDA. The regulatory SDA, which we'll talk a little bit more later on, is specifically an increase in energy consumption to remove excess nutrients, or essentially to burn off calories. Another output of energy is production. This is the creation of tissues or materials by an organism. This can be growth or repair of an organism's body. It can be production of tissues or materials for energy storage, such as fats in most mammals. This can be tissues that are made or that are destined to be cast off of the organism. This can be things like hair, which eventually are shed, or things like venoms and toxins by poisonous animals that are created to be transferred to another organism. Or it could be like the mucuses that are regularly sloughed off, like that of fishes that occur on the outside of fish. Or the protective mucuses along your inner gut that you rhythmically or regularly slough off as well. All of these are going to be types of production. Okay. Now that we have those specific details, we can make a more detailed energy budget equation rather than this simple energy inputs equal energy outputs. We can rewrite the equation this way. On the input side, we have the energy consumed, or the E intake. And this is less the energy lost as feces. We have to subtract that away. And this is the E sub loss. All of these inputs should be equal to the outputs. So on the other side, we have the energy used in the basal metabolic rate, or the E sub BMR, plus the energy used during activity, which is the E sub activity, plus the energy used during the SDA, which in this case is the E sub DIT, and then also the energy used during production of materials like growth, which is the E sub production. We now have a budget that is complete with credits and debits, the intakes and the outputs, incomes and expenditures. So let's talk a little bit more about this. So let's talk about what happens when our energy budget becomes unbalanced. The first place energy is credited or debited from is the energy used for production. Energy can be stored as materials in the body and can be taken from those stores when intake gets low. Some examples of this are glycogen and triglycerides, which are one particular kind of storage fat that can be formed during times of high energy availability. When not enough energy is consumed to meet energy expenditures, these molecules can be tapped into. Glycogen and triglycerides can be broken down, and extreme energy shortfalls, protein from skeletal muscle, can be used as well. However, over the long term, energy budgets tend to be very well balanced. Imagine your professor, Kurt Onthink, were to experience about a 10-pound weight gain over the course of this upcoming year. Now, that's a really massive weight gain, and it would be incredibly unhealthy for me to do that. Nevertheless, even with such a massive weight gain, that would represent only about 5% imbalance in the energy budget between intake and expenditures. That means a relative tight regulation between energy intakes and expenditures are going to be occurring. We need to maintain, and we do maintain, this very, very tight regulation between the energy that we're taking in and the energy that we're using or giving off. And this is going to be the topic of the next video.